The courthouse steps rose before him like a monument, each one a reminder of every barrier he'd ever been told he wouldn't climb. The stone was worn from decades of feet that had marched upward with degrees, power, entitlement. His own were steady, deliberate. He wasn't nervous. He had trained that part out of himself. He had learned early that nervousness, when worn on a young black man's face, is too often mistaken for incompetence. Inside his briefcase was a case file thicker than any he had handled as an intern. Highlighted margins, annotated case law, printouts of tenant ordinances and structural code violations. He knew every name, every date, every photograph in the appendix. He had spent the last 72 hours sleeping in 2-hour cycles, not because he was unprepared, but because he refused to give his opponents even a fraction of a procedural edge. It was his first day appearing solo. He was 26, and no one expected him to win. The courtroom was already half full by the time he arrived. The plaintiff's team sat in a row of navy suits and gray hair, whispering over their binders. Their lead counsel, Douglas Reeve, was a senior partner at one of the oldest firms in the city. He didn't look up as the young man walked in. The kind of dismissal that didn't need words. On the defense bench, there was just one chair. He sat. Across the aisle, a frail black woman sat beside a younger aide, hands clutching a wrinkled document. Her lease, her name printed on the docket in formal typeface, now a battleground. She had been served eviction papers on a technicality buried in a footnote. Her building had changed hands twice in 1 year, and the new owners wanted her gone before the redevelopment contract was finalized. No media had come. No one cared. Except him. He adjusted his tie, opened the binder, and began his ritual. Rereading every heading, every statute, every tab. Not to memorize it, he already had, but to center himself. At 9:03 a.m., the judge entered. A shuffle. A murmur. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. And then came the opening formalities: plaintiff name, defendant name, counsel appearances. When it was his turn to speak, he stood. His voice was low but clear. He stated his name, stated his bar number, and stated his representation of the defendant, Ms. Harriet Bloom. The judge squinted at him. "Counsel, your lead on this?" "Yes, Your Honor," he answered without pause. The plaintiff's bench chuckled softly but audibly. Douglas Reeve leaned toward his assistant, shielding his mouth with a hand as he whispered. And then came the first words that would define everything. "You're too young to be a lawyer." Not from the judge, not even from the court, but from the culture of the room. It hung in the air like an assumption. But the young man didn't flinch. He turned a page in his binder and waited, because while they were still judging him by his appearance, he had already read their entire playbook. And he was ready. The courtroom fell into rhythm. Pages rustled. Pens clicked. Typists logged every word in silent keystrokes. The clerk organized case exhibits with mechanical efficiency. But all of it seemed to orbit around a single gravitational truth. This case was never supposed to be a fight. The plaintiff's team treated it like a formality, a procedural sweep, a rubber-stamped eviction disguised as legal due process. Their confidence oozed from every motion. Douglas Reeve, with his $1,000 wristwatch and lazy charisma, delivered his opening statement as if he were speaking at a gala fundraiser rather than a courtroom. He painted Ms. Bloom's living situation as a misunderstanding, a routine correction of expired lease protocols, spoken in smooth syllables and hollow sympathy. He cited vague policy precedents, nodded to the judge's former clerkship under a conservative housing advocate, and closed his remarks with a line rehearsed to sound improvised. "This isn't a matter of injustice. It's a matter of compliance." Then he smiled like the verdict had already been written, and the room, knowingly or not, shifted in his favor. Until the young man stood. No one expected power in his presence. They didn't expect the deliberate pace as he approached the lectern. They didn't expect the calm in his breathing. And they didn't expect that his opening argument would begin not with legalese, but with a story. He didn't shout. He didn't appeal to emotion. He painted a timeline. A 30-year tenancy with no violations. Receipts from rent paid on time every month, including during the pandemic. a building that had fallen into disrepair while she stayed out of loyalty to a neighborhood that was being erased. He cited statutes with precision, used their own exhibits against them, pointing out how they had misquoted the city's emergency housing ordinance, Section 6, subsection 2C, by reversing the burden of responsibility. Then he paused and said just one sentence. Compliance doesn't erase cruelty. The court fell still. Reeves scoffed, but his eyes flickered. The judge leaned forward slightly, almost imperceptibly. The young man then submitted supplemental evidence, emails between the property managers and the redevelopment firm in which they discussed strategies to clear out long-term tenants before the new investors walked the building. The email wasn't illegal, but it was human, and it spoke louder than any footnote. For the first time that morning, the courtroom wasn't looking at his skin or his youth. They were looking at his preparation, his control, his quiet precision. Reeve requested a recess. Denied. The judge asked for clarifications. The young man answered every one without glancing at notes. He didn't stumble, because this wasn't just a case to him. It was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life without knowing how or when it would arrive. And he had decided it wouldn't be stolen by disbelief. Not again. The courtroom took on a different tone as the hours stretched into early afternoon. What had begun as a formality now bore the marks of a battle, a quiet one, fought not with raised voices or objections but with precision and presence. The energy shifted from scoffs to scrutiny. The once dismissive glances toward the young attorney had become measured, focused. He didn't falter. He moved through his defense with the clarity of a veteran, not the nerves of a newcomer. But beneath the calm exterior, he felt it all, every condescending smirk, every time someone mistook him for a clerk, every professor who once told him to polish his tone if he ever wanted to be taken seriously in a courtroom. He had been carrying all of that for years. And now each memory powered the steel in his voice. When the plaintiff's witnesses took the stand, he remained still, listening. They spoke of policy violations and tenant agreements, using jargon to confuse what was simple. They danced around accountability. Every statement was carefully worded to mask the truth that they had targeted an elderly black woman because she was easy to remove. But he didn't confront them. Not at first. He let them build their facade. And when the time came for cross-examination, he began dismantling it, not by attacking but by questioning with surgical intent. He asked the building supervisor to explain why repairs had gone undocumented for over 2 years, despite tenants reporting leaks and mold. He walked the jury through city complaint filings matched to the very same unit Ms. Bloom lived in. He asked a simple question: if she was such a problem tenant, why had she never once missed a payment in 30 years? There was no answer. Just silence. Reeve objected on grounds of irrelevance. Overruled. Then came the building inspector. He was asked under oath whether the eviction was timed to coincide with a property valuation. He hesitated. A bead of sweat crept down his temple. The answer came too slow. Not to my knowledge. The young lawyer nodded. Then produced a time-stamped email sent to the redevelopment firm dated just 2 days after the eviction notice, in which the inspector confirmed the unit would be cleared for inspection by end of week. The courtroom stirred. Reeves' mouth twitched. The judge raised her eyebrows. And for the first time in the trial, the young lawyer smiled. It wasn't arrogance. It was the satisfaction of seeing truth take form. He knew he hadn't won yet, but he had turned the current. When the session adjourned for the day, Ms. Bloom stood near the courtroom exit, eyes wide, mouth trembling with something between disbelief and hope. She didn't say a word. She just nodded. He nodded back. Because this wasn't about being the smartest man in the room. It was about making sure people like her weren't erased. And this time, the system would listen. Because he wouldn't let it do anything else. By the next morning, the courthouse felt different. Tighter. More awake. There was a buzz now, an unspoken awareness that something unexpected was unfolding. People who had originally dismissed the case as routine now lingered near the doors. A junior reporter from a local paper had taken a seat in the back row. 2 law students showed up mid-morning and quietly asked the clerk if they could observe. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The kid, because that's what some still called him, was winning. Not with theatrics. Not with shouting or courtroom antics. But with sheer, relentless competence. The young attorney arrived early again. Calm, composed, alone. His client, Ms. Bloom, walked beside him. She had stopped looking down at the floor when she entered the building. She walked straighter now. She smiled when he offered her the seat next to his table. They didn't speak, but she kept glancing at him like she still couldn't believe he was real. The plaintiff's side arrived later, but with less swagger. Douglas Reeve looked sharp as ever, tie pressed, briefcase shining, but the confidence had dulled. He spoke with more caution. His hands rested longer on the desk. His questions now sounded defensive instead of declarative. Because he knew. The tide had turned. That morning's session focused on expert testimony. The plaintiff brought in a city planner to explain zoning upgrades and redevelopment justifications. She spoke fluidly, citing contracts and statutes, leaning heavily on the legal technicalities that allowed them to remove tenants for nonconformance. But the young lawyer was ready. He stepped forward with a stack of old maps, historic zoning approvals, and recorded council meetings. Using a mounted screen, he walked the court through every shift in the district's layout over the last 15 years. He proved that Ms. Bloom's building had been nonconforming for over a decade, yet no action had been taken until the developers needed her out. Then he brought out a document he had saved for this moment. A signed letter tucked away in the city archives from a council member 5 years prior, promising permanent residency protection for all long-term tenants in that exact block. It wasn't law, but it was public record. And it told a story. That the city knew what was happening and had quietly allowed this machinery of removal to grow unchecked. He paused. Let the weight of that sink in. Then he said softly, "Policies should serve people, not erase them." The room held its breath. Even the judge didn't speak for a few seconds. Reeve stood but didn't object. He couldn't. The truth was too carefully constructed. The young man hadn't just created reasonable doubt. He had created moral gravity. As court recessed for lunch, Reeve pulled his co-counsel aside. There was no laughter. No smirking. Just whispered urgency and glances toward the defense table. Meanwhile, the young lawyer remained seated. He opened a small notebook, wrote down 2 more notes, reviewed the next exhibit tabs. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. There was still a verdict to reach. But somewhere between the judge's gaze and the jury's posture, he could feel it. He had earned more than just their attention. He had earned their respect. And now he had the momentum. Afternoon light poured through the high windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the wood-paneled walls. The quiet hum of anticipation filled the space. Everyone felt it, the nearness of something final. A week ago, this case was a footnote. Now it was a statement. And the man making that statement stood at the center of it all. Still as steel, the judge called for closing arguments. Douglas Reeve stood first. His tone was tempered now, his confidence wrapped in legal jargon and caveats. He reiterated statutes, defended technical violations, and attempted to reframe the issue as a contractual misunderstanding that had simply spiraled due to misinterpretation. His words were polished, rehearsed, and drained of all emotion. When he finished, he offered a final glance at the jury, a silent ask to look past the defense, past the details, and return to the safety of structure. Then the young attorney rose. No stack of papers in his hands. No theatrics. Just himself. He walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. The jurors watched him, not with skepticism, but with focus. He looked each of them in the eye before speaking. When he did, his voice was calm and steady, like the beginning of a song meant to be remembered. He didn't open with law. He opened with life. He told them about Harriet Bloom, her 31 years in the same rent-controlled apartment. Her birthday cakes for the neighbor's children. Her lost husband. The plants she kept in the windowsill, all of which she named. He painted her not as a defendant but as what she truly was, a person who had been quietly erased from the future plans of people who didn't care to know her name. Then, with care, he shifted. He walked them through the city's neglect. The building violations ignored. The convenient timing of the inspection. The redevelopment plans that mentioned her unit as vacant 2 months before the eviction notice was filed. And the deliberate use of obscure legal language to force her out. He pointed to the laws Reeve had quoted. Every one of those statutes was designed to protect both sides, he said. But here, it was used to silence only one. Then he turned to the jury again. I know I don't look like what you expected. I've heard it, felt it, lived it. And maybe you didn't expect to be here either, sitting in judgment over a case that should have been over before it began. But I ask you not to see me. Not even her. See the truth? Because no matter how clean a contract looks on paper, if it's soaked in injustice, then it is not legal. It is just dressed-up cruelty. The room was frozen. He paused. And in the stillness he added, you don't need to change the law today. Just stop it from being used as a weapon. Then he returned to his seat and the silence held. It was the kind of silence that doesn't wait to be broken, it expands, filling lungs and rooms and ideas. The jury watched him. The judge made notes. Reeve stared down at his desk. Ms. Bloom wiped a tear with a trembling hand. The gavel dropped. Jury dismissed. Deliberations began. The young lawyer exhaled. And waited. The minutes stretched into hours, each second thick with expectation. The courtroom had emptied and refilled twice, spectators cycling in, curious eyes watching the door where the jury would re-enter. The court clerk paced gently. A reporter refreshed her notes. Even the opposing counsel had stopped fidgeting. But the young lawyer, he was still. He sat at the defense table, spine straight, gaze steady. His hands rested on the closed binder in front of him, not gripping, not shaking. His client sat beside him, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had barely spoken all day. She didn't need to. She had already said everything the system had tried to erase. And he had repeated it loud enough for them all to hear. At 4:43 p.m. the jury returned. The shuffling of their feet on the polished floor echoed with finality. 12 faces, all unreadable. The foreman held the verdict in both hands as he passed it to the bailiff. The courtroom seemed to inhale as the paper made its way to the judge's bench. Time slowed. The judge unfolded the sheet. Her eyes scanned the page, her expression unreadable. Then, with a steady voice, she read, "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Ms. Harriet Bloom." Gasps cut through the silence. The plaintiff's table slumped in place. Reeve blinked slowly, the color draining from his cheeks. The young lawyer didn't cheer. He didn't move. He closed his eyes for a moment and bowed his head, not in prayer, but in release. Then he looked to Ms. Bloom. She didn't smile right away. Her breath caught in her throat and her lip trembled. Then, with a hand over her mouth, she exhaled decades of waiting in a single whisper of disbelief. She had won. Because of him. The judge thanked the jury. The courtroom adjourned. Chairs scraped against the floor as people began to move. But the moment didn't fade, it deepened. Ms. Bloom turned to him, eyes glassy. "You saved my home," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "No," he thought, but didn't say. "You defended your home. I just reminded them it mattered." Outside the courthouse, the winter wind cut across the city. He stood on the sidewalk alone, staring up at the gray sky between buildings. Reporters moved past him to chase Reeve down the steps. Colleagues exited in packs. But no one looked at him. And that was fine. Because his presence had never been about recognition. It was about reconstruction. Of trust. Of dignity. Of belief in a system that too often erased people like him and her. A voice called his name from behind. It was one of the law students from the gallery. She approached nervously, holding a notepad. "Was that really your first trial?" He nodded. She blinked. "That was incredible." He smiled, small, grateful. Then turned, walked toward the street, and disappeared into the city. There would be more cases. More courtrooms. More battles fought in rooms not built for him. But now his voice had been heard. And nothing would ever silence it again.